Welcome to our second ARPA roundtable of municipal leaders. Feel free to turn on your videos and mute or unmute yourself as necessary. I'm Michael Indolo from MRB Group. We are the Economic Recovery Coordinators for the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. If anybody is having audio or visual trouble, we do have some folks standing by to help you, but hopefully it'll all work out perfectly. And I know we are still getting a few more people coming on here. It looks like we have a great turnout. Okay, so you should be able to see a PowerPoint. I'm going to give just a very brief introduction today, and I'm going to hand it off to Matt Horn and Barbara Van Epps from NICOM. I'll introduce them as well. And if you would, you can see you have a little chat button on your screen. Just like last time, I think it went really well. We had lots and lots of chatter on the chat that I think was quite good in terms of people sharing resources, asking questions, answering questions, following up with additional information. So please feel free to do that all along the way here. One note, Genesee Finger Lakes, I think probably everybody on the call is familiar, but if you're not, Genesee Finger Lakes is the 9-county Regional Planning Commission. It's been around for over 50 years. It does many different things, but under 4 broad categories: local regional planning, water and related planning, economic development, which is what I'm involved with the organization, data technology, and the resource center. In addition to being the Regional Planning Council, it is also the USEDA Economic Development District. And under the CARES Act, it received an allocation of funding with which it used to hire us as the Economic Recovery Coordinators from MRB Group and our Smarter Local Government Division, which I'll just give you a 30-second here. We are MRB Group has historically been mostly engineering and design work. And about 10 years ago, we started Smarter Local Government, and it's all about helping every aspect of government, from municipal services to economic development to long-range planning, technical review planning, GIS, you name it, we do it. And today is one example of that, where we're bringing together community leaders to discuss an important topic, which is ARPA funding, how to use it, what to avoid, and how to stay within the bounds of regulation. So with that, I will hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Matt. And again, once again, encourage you to join us via the chat and chime in as needed. Thank you. Matt, you're on mute. Oh, Matt, you're on mute.
Trust me, it only gets worse from here. You'll like me a lot better.
You're still on mute.
Richard Moy
has joined the meeting.
Are you able to hear me now? Oh no.
I can hear you, Matt.
All right. Well, while Matt is figuring out his audio, you just keep trying away, okay, Matt? And I'll continue the conversation here. American Rescue Plan it envisions a wide range of investments, and we'll see in just a moment the different types of allowable investments within the ARPA framework. The funding is split into 2 cycles. Many of you on this call have, oh, I'm sorry, you could hear Matt. I'm hearing that you could hear Matt. Maybe I'm the one that's got the problem on this end then. Who here can give me a thumbs up that you hear Matt? Oh, well then it's my problem. Sorry, Matt. Apologize for that.
Matt who?
I don't know what's wrong with my audio then.
Trust me, it only gets worse from here. Anybody hear me? Everybody out there can hear me? Everybody except Michael? All right, good. Well, this will be interesting because Michael will have to intuit when I'd like the slides to advance. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Local Government Services for MRB Group. I've been in the region for almost 15 years and spent a big chunk of that in in Geneva as the city manager there. But all through my career, I've had good fortune to have interacted with lots of different grants, lots of different funding sources. And I can tell you that my assessment, even though we're on the front end of this, my assessment is that this ARPA funding is going to be, for most of you out there, for most of the communities in the Finger Lakes region, this is going to be what I would call easy money to spend. Some of the reporting requirements, some of the concerns folks have had around reporting and compliance. I think while you should certainly be careful, I think we'll illustrate today that you can move in relatively due course to get your funds in and out the door onto some valuable projects. We'll talk you through that a little bit today. I call it a monumental investment. It's something that is I haven't seen in my career where the federal government has gone direct to states and direct to local governments. The state isn't taking a skim, as far as we can tell. At least under the law, they're not supposed to. There's not a bunch of additional rules and regulations, but generally, what we've found is we think it's going to be some relatively easy money to spend. So effectively, we see this break out into two buckets. The first are COVID-related expenses. So these are things where some municipalities we've worked with, some organizations we've worked with, did a really good job from day one. They recognized this as kind of a more traditional emergency situation and started tracking those costs and services that needed to be provided from day one. And for folks who did that or who reasonably can go back and do that now, kind of parse through the expenses you've had as they relate to COVID, all of those funds, all of those expenses, you're able to recoup by virtue of this funding. And then once you've recouped them, you can use them for your own municipal purposes, how you see fit. Additionally, we've seen some communities who've had revenue impacts. The interesting thing here is that the federal government has presumed that any revenue impact that's happened from 19 to 20 can be attributed to COVID. And so similarly, if you've had a COVID related or if you've had a revenue impact from 19 to 20, I call it scraping. You could just scrape that portion of your allocation right off the top and use it for your more traditional municipal purposes, or really however you see fit under municipal law. So that's one bucket, that COVID related expenses bucket, and COVID related revenue impacts. In the other bucket, we're basically just generally referring to this as infrastructure, but it should be noted that it's broad, but not crazy broad in terms of the types of infrastructure: water, wastewater, stormwater, broadband. And on the water and wastewater side and stormwater side, if it's clean water revolving fund eligible or drinking water revolving fund eligible, it's going to be considered eligible under this program. Broadband is pretty general. I'll note that relative to the state revolving fund designation, you don't actually have to be listed. You just have to be eligible for listing. So the feds didn't want to create a whole new list of projects and project categories. So they just identified this old revolving fund list as eligible expenses. And before we move on the slide, I just wanted to say that on the COVID related expenses side, this also can apply to individual COVID impacts of your residents, of your businesses. And we can dig at that later if folks have specific questions. But in large part, when we're talking about allowable expenses, we're talking about COVID related expenses or these infrastructure needs. Go ahead, Michael. So all of that being said, now my advice to you is to slow down. Many of you, most of you actually, have already received the first installment of these funds. So what we didn't hit on that first slide is that these funds are being allocated in, they call them tranches, 2 tranches or 2 installments. The first is due this year. Many of you have already gotten that. The next will come next year. But we'll talk about how long you have to spend this money in a couple of slides. But I'll tell you, it's not 90 days. It's not 6 months. You have time. And so take a breath. That's our recommendation at this point. We call it once in a generation or once in a career. And now is not the time to get hasty with how you want to spend it. So our recommendation really is for municipalities to think about those buckets, particularly if you're not going to look at recouping COVID-related expenses. If you really are just going to look to infrastructure, or you've been able to repurpose some of your COVID-related expense recovery to other projects, take a breath and do a needs assessment. If you're not a community that engages actively in capital improvement planning and multi-year capital improvement planning, now's a good time to do that, to say, all right, what water and sewer needs are out there? What's our broadband situation? I see Brian Pincelli on the call from Wayne County and a couple of Wayne County supervisors on the call. They have gone down the road a bit on a broadband assessment. So these numbers are starting to come together in terms of total need and total potential project information. Try your best. It's hard, but try your best to assess your needs absent those COVID dollars. So almost forgetting that they exist and say, what really are our water, wastewater, stormwater, broadband needs? And then once you've got that list together, when you go into project selection, you need to think about a couple of things in terms of how you're going to use these ARPA funds. So I mentioned you have a couple of years to use them, but any of you who've done any kind of significant infrastructure project, you know it takes a couple of years to get that stuff up and running, right? You don't just wake up tomorrow and start work on a wastewater plant. There's design and permitting and procurement that have to take place. And so while you do have a little time, when you move into project selection, you should think about a couple of things. One, the timeline of development. Can we have every nickel of this project expended by December 31st, 2026? That's the deadline for spending all of this money. So can you have your project up, started, completed, expended by that time frame? Second, in terms of up and ready, if you're going to have any other funding sources that are mixed in with this, are they available now? What's the drawdown time? Are they going to be able to be drawn down and expended in alignment with that ARPA calendar? So just be mindful of that. When you're thinking about project readiness, think about the timeline to develop and the additional funding needed. Go ahead, Michael. So once you've selected your projects, you're out to bid, you're ready to go to work. Start to think about, I'll start by saying the law gives local government a lot of deference, gives local governments deference in terms of your procurement practices. If you're a non-entitlement unit, you effectively just need to follow your own standard procurement requirements. Now in New York State, we know that public procurement, particularly on public works projects, any kind of significant construction project that you're going to engage in with these funds, there's still pretty rigorous procurement requirements around that. But just because that money's flowing through the state cannot impose any additional requirements over and above those that are spelled out in the act. So as you're going out to bid on these, unless inside of your own procurement standards, you don't have any MWBE requirements. Unless you have those requirements yourselves, you won't have those requirements as part of this. We'll talk a little bit about prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon. I want to strike a difference between those two. The guidance, the interim rule on as it relates to Davis-Bacon in particularly, exempts these projects from Davis-Bacon, but then goes on to say the federal government is paying attention to how you procure these, and they want you to take care that labor standards are considered through this. So if you got specific questions about that, let me know. But generally, I would say if you're just following your own procurement practices, you're following New York's standard rules about public projects and prevailing wage in that regard, you'll be pretty safe. One other note on that. If you are using these funds in alignment or together with other public funding sources, so you got a CDBG grant that you want to throw this money in with, or a USDA grant or USDA loan that you want to throw this money in with, then all of these funds they're all going to smush together inside of those USDA, CDBG, HUD, inside of those procurement requirements. So I wouldn't go to any efforts to segment this from those. You're gonna be held to that procurement standard of the other funding source of your other funding source. No matter what you're doing, no matter how you're spending this money, document. You know, I don't want to scare anybody. There's not a bunch of range riders of federal auditors out there waiting to sink their teeth into you, but it's possible. You can be monitored, you can be audited, and you want to take care to have as much of the documentation around this process, beginning with procurement, as a standalone file, so that if you are audited or you are monitored, you're able to pull these files right away and show we followed our traditional procurement process. Similarly, when you're managing your project, just manage it in accordance with with your standard project management framework. Keep a separate project accounting. When we do capital project accounting in municipalities, we typically stand up a separate capital project for for each of these efforts. And so if you're doing a wastewater project, a treatment project, or a collection project, create a separate capital project inside of your accounting system, so that you can track your payment applications, your expenses. Like we say, there's no additional requirement necessarily around ARPA funded projects, but you just want to take good care to make sure that your bases are covered. You're all doing the right things out there already. Just keep doing them and pay special attention to these funds. As I noted, December 31st, 2026 is the last day to have a penny go out the door on these projects. But December 31st, 2024 is the last day to encumber or commit these projects, right? So you have to go under contract by December 31st, 2024 for every nickel of the funds that are good. Then you got an additional 2 years to spend it, but just make sure that you've formally committed the funds, obligated them by December 31st, 2024. Michael? We hammered this on the procurement side, but similarly on all matters of record keeping around this. Keep a separate project file. Keep a separate ARPA drawer somewhere so that you can just go get it when you need it. If you get a call or get a question or get monitored, you've got the documents available. There were some questions in our last session about this single audit requirement. So some of you might be familiar with this issue. The federal government requires a standalone audit of federal expenditures if your municipality expends more than $750,000 in any given fiscal year. There is no new or special requirement on this as it relates to ARPA, except to say that these funds count towards that tabulation. So if you got a CDBG grant earlier this year for $500,000 or a DOT grant earlier this year for $500,000, and then you got ARPA funds for another $250,000, now you've triggered the single audit requirement. If you don't have any other federal funds this year and you don't get $750,000 or you don't spend $750,000 of your ARPA funds this year, then you will not be held to that standard. There are no special audit requirements as it relates to these funds. It just counts against your more traditional audit requirements. If you have questions about that in particular, if you've got an external auditor that handles your books each year for your municipality, your annual financial reporting, best to talk to them. But I think their guidance will be the same. They'll know, you'll know whether you've received enough funds to worry about this. On the reporting side, if most of the people on this call, or at least the list I saw, most of you would be considered non-entitlement units. If you would know if you were an entitlement units are much larger municipalities who annually typically receive community development block grant allocations. Smaller communities, those who are not those who are not entitlement units, you're required to make one filing a year, one annual filing to demonstrate your expenditure compliance, just to make sure that you're spending your funds in alignment with the requirements of the Act. If there are entitlement communities on the call, shoot me a note. Barbara's contact information is out there. Michael's contact information. Any of us can kind of point you to a resource who will give you some additional information on what entitlement units are required to do. But in looking over the attendees here today, it looks like the vast majority of you, if not all of you, are from non-entitlement units. So it's literally just one report per year, and it's a fairly straightforward. Go ahead, Michael. So that's it. I mean, it really is simple. The things I would tell you are, be mindful. We have time from right now. We've got over 5 years to get all of the money right out the door. We've got about 3 years to get it all committed. So take your time. Think about how you might best invest this once in a lifetime or once in a generation or once in a career opportunity, and plan it out. Think smart about how you're going to use it. A reminder, has to have a direct tie to COVID-19. If you're going to scrape it off, if you're going to move it into your general fund, it's got to be shown as a reimbursement against a direct COVID-related expenditure or a COVID-related revenue impact, or it has to support allowable infrastructure investments: water, sewer, stormwater, broadband infrastructure. Don't worry too much about compliance. There's not a ton out there. Be smart about your record keeping and get the money out the door on time. And I think it should be an easy program for you to administer. So Barbara has already seen some questions floating around out there. Barbara, you want to jump in and talk about what you've seen so far?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. I don't usually use WebEx, so I'm struggling a little to make sure my audio and video is sufficient. But first of all, let me thank Mike and Matt for inviting me to join you all today. We work very closely with MRB, have for many, many years. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. My one disclaimer is I cannot be the arbiter of all things ARPA and eligible uses. There is a lot of information out there, as Matt referred to. And much of that is on NICOM's homepage on our website. So if you're a member of NICOM, hopefully you've seen that. If you're not a member of NICOM, I will give you a little secret. It is on our public page. So you don't need to, log into our system to access that information. But we have an entire section dedicated to ARPA, categorized by reporting, by revenue loss, by eligible uses, all of those things, with a lot of good resources, not just stuff we put together, but all the Treasury documentation is up there. There's a great calculator that GFOA put together to determine your lost revenue. So there's a lot of really valuable information on our website. That is the first place I refer people to, because in terms of eligibility, what's eligible, what's not, the best place I can say to try to get some guidance on that is two places. One being the FAQs that the Treasury has put out and continually updates, because those FAQs are based on questions that they are getting from actual recipients all across the country. And the second is, if you look at the reporting guidance that they have issued, there are expenditure categories. There's 7 expenditure categories and then 66 subcategories. So one way for you can kind of back into determining whether your expense is an eligible expense by looking at those categories and subcategories. If one of the things you're thinking about spending that money on falls into those subcategories, then that's a pretty good sign that that will be an eligible expense. So I just encourage you to look at that documentation. Just in terms of questions, I mean, I get dozens of questions a day, and many of them are very specific. Can I spend it on this wastewater treatment project? Can I spend it on, this particular infrastructure update or capital project? I thought I would just start with some more generic questions that we've been getting. Some obvious, some maybe not so obvious. The fact that we're still getting the same questions means that many of them are not that obvious. First of all, as Matt alluded to, this is not done via reimbursement. Most of you have received your money, at least your first tranche of money. If you haven't received that, I do encourage you to reach out to me or the division of the budget, because there is still time. They are trying to get every single municipality who is entitled to money to make sure that they get this money, and you had to go through, a number of steps in order to get that. So if anyone is on this webinar that has not received their money yet, there is still time, so don't be discouraged. But obviously it's not reimbursement based. There's no pre-approval. You're not going to be pre-approved by the state. You're not going to be pre-approved by the feds, but there are clawback provisions. So to the extent you report that you spent your money on a particular project or activity, and the feds look at it and think, well, maybe that wasn't a proper use or an appropriate use, they will issue a recoupment notice, and you will have to then document and prove to them how you think. So there's an appeals process, if you will. They're not going to just come and take your money. But to Matt's point, document, because they could down the road, even though they're not going to pre-approve it, they could down the road, tell you that they want that money back. So like I said, there's lots of resources out there that will help you along the way. You have plenty of time to spend this money, but I just put that out there. The other question we keep getting are there tax cap implications? The short answer to that is no, because this is federal revenue. Your tax cap is obviously a cap on your tax levy. But to the extent you use some of this revenue to adjust your tax levy, well, then yes, there will be indirect tax cap implications. But on the face of it, this should have no direct impact on your tax cap. And then the last thing I want to point out, which is was I think a late add to the FAQs, is that, and OSC, if you haven't seen the OSC guidance on how to account for this money and proper budgeting practices, that is also on our website, and OSC participated in our last webinar on this. And it's important that you take a look at that documentation to figure out how you account for the money, what the proper codes are, etc. But you are allowed to earn interest on all of this money. Okay, and OSC is encouraging you to put it in a separate bank account just for purposes of, because of the tracking requirements, but put it in an interest-bearing bank account, and that interest can be used for any purpose that you want. It is not restricted to the eligible uses outlined under ARPA. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. A lot of times, either the interest has to go back or the interest has to be spent on whatever you receive that grant for example. But in the case of ARPA, the FAQ document explicitly says that that interest can be used for any purpose. So I just wanted to point that out to all of you before we get into the nitty-gritty of eligible use.
All right, thank you very much.
We
Mark.
talk about once in a generation. Virtually every federal dollar you've ever received had the explicit statement, you shall not earn interest. And when you do earn program revenue, it shall be spent this way. That's fantastic.
Yes. And like I said, that was a late ad, so we're trying to make sure we get that word out to people.
Interesting. Not a super robust interest environment today, but we got a couple of years for that, for those interest rates.
Exactly. We'll hope that improves as we go through this process.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Barbara. That's so helpful. Some questions are coming in via chat. I encourage anybody to submit questions that way. I see some familiar faces and some friends out there who I might just poke to get a conversation going if things get too quiet. But the first question I see kind of up on the board here is has to do with supporting businesses, and I threw a half a sentence in there at the tail end of the COVID related expense category. So if you remember those two buckets, we were trying to kind of force things into two chutes. And on the COVID related impacts side versus the infrastructure side, there are provisions in the law that allow you to make direct allocations to individuals in your community who've been disproportionately impacted, nonprofits whose job it is to mitigate issues associated with COVID, or businesses who experienced impacts related to COVID. And I'll limit this to the business side because I can't think of cases where individuals might do this, but where in a business scenario where businesses are going to take steps to further reduce the chances of spread, right, of infection spread or virus spread. So Kathy Rayburn from Victor is who asked this question, and you know, the strings, and Barbara, please jump in if you hear me misstate, which I tend to be an optimist, so I like to ride around the edge of the rules, and Barbara is smarter than that. So if the way we understand the law today, you know, you could work with a nonprofit to set up a program that might assist local businesses who can demonstrate that either they've been impacted by COVID or they are going to take steps to reduce spread opportunity inside of their business. Think about what you did in your own village halls, city halls, whether it was, you know, move people around, spread people out, change out your air handling equipment, put the plastic dividers up between people, or any of those kinds of things that would have reduced the spread. Those are all eligible expenses, and you can set up a program to allocate those funds to individual businesses for those types of expenses.
Has left the meeting.
The issue or the challenge, not an issue necessarily, is you are on the hook for compliance, right? So what the guidance is saying, the interim rule has said is, you need to be able to put a monitoring program in place or have some reporting mechanism, because the federal government's not going to go to Joe's Crab Shack and check out the plastic dividers and grab the receipts to make sure that Joe spent the money the way he said he would. They're going to go to you and look for the compliance documentation. And so I encourage you, and we can't get too deep, I don't think, but I encourage you, A, to think creatively about how you might set up programs that would support businesses if that's an interest of yours. B, to think about how you would, given the guidance inside of the interim rule and other guidance, how you might empower or charge businesses with demonstrating the COVID impact, and then how you would track those expenses alongside the business. So it's possible. We're happy to talk about it further if there are other questions around it, and certainly we're happy to trade emails on something like that. So it's a good question for Barbara to poke a little deeper at that. As a municipality, would you be responsible? I think I know the answer to this, but are you responsible for proving that those individuals or businesses have had associated losses before you allocate the money to them? My sense would be, again, you have to kind of set up some measure, some way, whether they're attesting to it, whether you ask them for balance sheets. These are all things. These are all opportunities, right, Barbara? I mean,
I agree. Yes, there's no, there's no detailed specific answer to that, but there is an expectation there that would be the case, and so you want to have some way, and again, look at those reporting documents, because I think they're very helpful. The guidance document that they put out several weeks ago, that's on our website. You want to be able to prove, yes, to a certain extent that there was a COVID loss or a direct impact on these businesses. I mean, they talk about tourism and travel and hospitality. Those are going to be fairly simple to prove, I think, but it's not limited to those businesses. And they make that very clear in the rule that this is a non-exclusive list. So, but again, I think the important thing, and Matt emphasized this, is the reporting requirements. Really, you are the ones who are going to be ultimately responsible for that. Even when you dole out money to these sub-recipients, the rule makes it clear that you as the first recipient are going to be the ones who's actually on the hook. So you need to make sure that they're aware of the reporting requirements, that they're complying with them. Whoever this money goes, is distributed to through you as the main recipient of the funds.
Make it logical, make it again, something that's readily accessible, make it standardized across the board. If you have some reason or some logic behind what you're doing, you're in a better place than if you just divide it up by the number of people in your community and issue a check, right?
Right.
So a question about COVID financial impacts. So one of the calculations are really, they've become refined since the start of this program. The federal government has started as it issued more and more guidance. It got more and more refined. So I want to make sure I'm not talking from a place in the past. Generally, the way I've explained to municipalities about how to account for COVID-related revenue losses was to look at your bottom line number for 2019 and then look at your bottom line number for 2020. There's going to be a difference there. You want to understand what caused the difference, right? So in cases of one-time money, right? So you got a big grant in 2019 that you didn't get in 2020. That you're gonna have to back that out, right? They're not going to allow you to count that as a loss into 2020. If you adjusted your tax rate down, if you were in 19 and you got into your 2020 budget and you said, hey, we want to give folks a break, it's a tough time, and you adjusted your tax rate down, then any losses associated with that are going to have to be backed out of the calculation. The question here, Barbara, that I think is an interesting one is if you received FEMA or state emergency management offsets or reimbursements. Those are those one-time dollars, right? Those are things that you're going to have to back out as you're doing your math. Is that accurate?
So I'm not sure if I fully agree, but I do want to, I don't know if you can see, there's this handy dandy little chart and it is on our website because the way, and this is a part of the document that the Treasury put out. The way that they define revenue has to do with the Census Bureau classification of revenue. So this chart tells you anything in green, which can be counted in your revenue calculation. And if I were tech savvy enough to get this up on the screen, I would. And anything in red cannot be counted. So tax revenue, including property taxes, is something that can be included in that calculation. So I'm not sure, Matt, to your point about if you reduced revenue, if you reduced your property tax, you needing to back that out. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that. State aid, a reduction in state aid in your base year can count towards your calculation of the revenue loss. So when I say your base year, the base year is the full fiscal year prior to January 27th, 2020. That is your base year, okay? You're going to take that year, and basically what you're doing is just comparing what the revenues would have been in the next year had COVID not occurred. And you have to go through this calculation. I won't try to get into that, but like I said, there's a calculator on our website because you have to take a growth rate, if you will. It can either be 4.1% or your average annual growth over the 3 years prior to COVID. Okay, so you want to take the higher of those numbers, either the 4.1% or your average annual over those 3 years. And you're basically going to apply that growth rate. And to the extent your actual revenues were less than what the growth rate would have allowed them to be, whatever that difference is, that's the money that you can spend on anything, any provision of governmental services. But in terms of what counts in that revenue calculation, first of all, it has to be across the board. It has to be entity-wide. So you can't say, well, I had this major reduction in sales tax, but these other 3 categories of revenues went up. So it has to be a net number. You can't just include the downs and not the ups, okay? So it's an entity-wide calculation, and you include what's on this little chart, what they say can be included, which is a lot. One thing you cannot include, to Matt's point, FEMA, because anything from the feds, you have to back out of the calculation. But state aid does count. So to the extent your state aid decreased, and oftentimes that happens here in New York State, that can be part of that calculation. So it's basically, comparing what your base year revenues were compared to what your revenues would have been going forward had COVID not happened. And whatever that difference is between your actual and your projected, that's what you get to spend on any provision of government services. I know that it's very complicated, but when you look at the calculator on our website, I think it'll help to determine what that lost revenue number should look like.
And Michael just dropped the link to that chart that Barbara's got in the chat. So if you want to, if you click there, you'll be able to grab it. I'll also clarify. I was just doing while Barbara was walking through that. I was trying to remember where I saw that provision about lowering taxes. Interestingly enough, it only applies to state taxes. So states were prohibited from lowering their tax rate and supplementing it with ARPA funds. Localities were not prohibited. So, so don't worry about that.
Right.
That's good news.
And this raises another, maybe this is a frequently asked question as well, Matt, to your point. So you're absolutely right. The rule explicitly says, the law explicitly says that states cannot use this money to reduce taxes. However, nowhere does the rule or the FAQs or anything out, any of the documentation say that you as local governments can use this money to directly to reduce taxes. But there's no prohibition either. So we use this concept of all money is green. So to the extent you had something in your tax levy that you were going to have to fund with city, village, town, or county taxes, and now you can fund that with ARPA, well, indirectly, that's going to help you to reduce taxes. So you're just, you're moving the pots of money around. So while there's no prohibition that says you can't use this money to reduce taxes, it doesn't actually come up in the list of eligible uses either. But obviously, to the extent you can, use ARPA funds to fund something that you were otherwise going to fund with your tax levy, well, then indirectly, you're able to lower taxes that way.
We're seeing some more questions come in. I think around timing of revenue impact. I've been generally reporting this as your year end number from 19 to 20. Is that accurate, Barbara?
Well, so believe it or not, you'll get to do this calculation 4 times. Okay, so your first year is so again, your base year is that year, yes, the year prior to COVID. So whatever your full fiscal year was prior to January 27, 2020, that's going to be your base year. Okay, and then you get to do this calculation 4 times at 4 different points of time. So the first one is by December 31, 2020. The second one is December 31, 2021. December 31, 2022, and December 31, 2023. So you're actually going to have several opportunities, because while we don't anticipate you're going to see as much revenue declines going forward, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, maybe some of your businesses end up going out of business. You're not going to get that sales tax revenue. I mean, a lot of things can happen. So you actually have 4 opportunities to do this calculation going forward. And again, if you look, there's 2 good places to look for this. And that GFOA calculator, which is on, like I said, on our website, but also the interim final rule has a handy dandy little chart in this section about the revenue loss that kind of, it gives a picture of what this looks like going forward and the 4 different points of time. So your base year is always going to be that fiscal year prior to COVID, but you do have opportunities to assess your revenue losses going forward.
So Dave McDowell, I'm going to read your question aloud. I personally don't understand it. Barbara or Michael might, so I might ask you to restate your question or help define a term for me. Dave's question is, does employee acknowledgement fall into COVID expense? Not familiar with that term. Barbara, Michael?
and I'm not very good with the chat box either, but employee acknowledgement, you mean there are provisions that will allow you to compensate essential employees, both retroactively to the extent that they were performing, well, retroactively during COVID. Essential employees are usually those that interact with the public or are handling items that are handled by other people. So it's sanitation workers. It's, to a certain extent, it could be people who work in your village offices or city offices. So you can, and maybe, I'm not sure if this is what he's getting at, but you can acknowledge those people or compensate those people either retroactively or going forward through this premium pay concept.
Well, I'll explain it a little bit. All
Okay.
of our employees received full pay whether they worked or not.
Right.
We had one employee who worked every day and handled everything full time, never left the office. And I would like to reward that employee or thank that employee for doing that.
And I believe in that case you could, because that employee was in the office, assuming they were having to deal with the public. I mean, that's sort of the key issue here, is the way they define essential employees are those employees who had constant interaction with the public, or like I said, handling items that were handled by other people. But
Yes.
and there are limitations on that. I think you can go up to, don't quote me on this, $13, an additional $13 an hour more, or $25,000 annually, maybe. But if you have more, Dave, if you have more detailed questions on that, you can certainly reach out to me directly. But there is a section in the rule on premium pay that speaks to this, and it can apply both retroactively and going forward, provided they fit that definition of essential workers.
Thank you.
Other questions, ideas? Anybody's already got a program up and running that they want to brag about? So one of the other pieces of infrastructure that we didn't talk about, but that that has started to come up in a lot of our conversations, that in the FAQ section of the Treasury guidance, they make specific references to parks and open spaces, with the general idea that, again, if people are not confined to an indoor space, then the likelihood of spread decreases. And so when we were working through a program like New York Main Street is the example that bubbles to mind in recent years. New York Main Street offered an additional bump in their allocation to communities that were developing outdoor dining, outdoor gathering is the wrong word, but outdoor spaces that would keep people from engaging, or that would spread people out. So parks, and they reference it directly, parks and trails and the like appear to be eligible expenses under ARPA. Any refinement on that, Barbara? Am I being too blunt with that?
No, I think that's a great point to make, because they did, and that again was one of those issues that they added to the FAQs, presumably because they were getting a lot of questions on it. But the idea being parks were overused, if you will, or used more than they normally would have been during COVID. So there's additional wear and tear that results in additional maintenance. But also going forward, that's a good way, to socially distance, to mitigate the impacts of COVID going forward. So to Matt's point, that's a good one. The Treasury makes that, and we're getting a lot of questions on parks, because now we're saying, we brought this up on our webinar, and people are like, well, what about the road into the park? Because everybody wants to know if they can pave their roads. That's all everybody cares about, is paving their roads. So, the road going into the park, I think you could make the argument for that same reason. If the people are going to overuse the park, they overuse the road to get to the park. So in that case, I think the road would count. The other place I will point out where you can do your roads without having to use the lost revenue money, because lost revenue money, to the extent you can make that calculation, that money can go to anything, including your roads. But generally speaking, as we pointed out, the infrastructure is water, sewer, and broadband. So roads don't fall in the infrastructure category. However, the FAQ does point out that to the extent you have to rip up a road in order to get underneath it to address your water or your sewer pipes or lines, that road can be repaired with ARPA funds. So I just point that out. But like I said, you know, to the extent you can move money around, or to the extent you have money in that lost revenue category, you can pave all the roads you want.
Mike, it's time to buy some stock and in situ form and start slip lining all the water lines and don't dig up any streets. Just fix all the pipes and then pretend that the feds can pay for everything.
I was also thinking about some streets that I know communities are looking to upgrade, and wondering if you cracked the street to replace the pipe, and it used to have open swale drainage and and crumbling concrete curbs, and you put back really nice stormwater and granite curbing and the like. Is all of that ARPA eligible?
This is not the time to start building those bridges to nowhere again.
Here's a cool question, something that that I think is it might be applicable across a number of places. I've seen a few of these. Someone notes that they created transitional open space this year, so space that wouldn't traditionally be used as parkland, but they created it for the purposes of or for use during COVID time. Are those if it's not going to be permanent parkland, they put some money into it a year ago, maybe next year it's not going to be parkland, is that a recoverable expense? Barbara, do you think?
That is an interesting question. That, you know, I don't know about that one. I mean, I think again, you can make the argument that you're just trying to provide a place where people can go, you know, this whole, because it's the impacts of COVID, but it's also trying to mitigate COVID going forward. So I think, again, you know, you have to think creatively in this, and I don't mean that in a coy sort of way, but you just gotta, you know, that's why I say, look at the FAQs, look at the eligible activities, the categories, if you will, in the reporting requirements, because I think it'll help you to try to sort of think outside the box. But I think to the extent maybe you can make the argument that this is for the community to be able to come out and use this open space and social distance, but still be out and getting exercise and having fun. And I think you might be able to squeeze it in there, but don't, again, you know, what happens on this webinar stays on this. No, what I was going to, you know, I try to offer my advice based on all of the information that's out there, what I've read. And I should say this too, and for the, you know, I'm sure the county association and the town association have the same contacts and connections, but we have someone at NLC who has a direct line to the Treasury. So when I get these tough questions, I just shoot this gentleman an email, and he reaches out to Treasury and tries to get me an answer. And again, they aren't always willing to say, yes, you know, Village of Sodish, you can do this, but, you know, at least they can give you some broad parameters or places to look. So I'm happy, like I said, I'm happy to follow up on any individual, you know, request or questions or projects that you're uncertain about. But I think, again, I think you can, you know, make the argument that even that transitional open space might be something that might be eligible.
Could it even relate to Barbara or Matt, to the idea of the mental health, behavior health kind of program that might be connected to that open space and their ability to provide, shall we say, respite or, you know, a little, you know, TQM as far as, you know, why that space in the first place was even designated?
I actually like that angle a lot, because mental health is certainly something that is talked about throughout the interim final rule. And, you know, how COVID, you know, one of the implications of COVID and the negative impacts of COVID was clearly mental health. So I think that's a good approach to take, to think about when you're in that particular instance.
It's a question that I'm getting a lot. I'm not getting this specific question a lot, but it's a variation on a theme. The specific question is, hey, we used our highway department truck bays for public meetings, public hearings, so that we could comply with social distancing. So improvements like ventilation, insulation, those kinds of things, to be paid for with ARPA funds to prepare for a future incident like this.
Resiliency.
So, one of the common themes that I'm receiving questions about is hazard mitigation. So in the future, we're going to be grappling with issues like this. We didn't have facilities before to deal with this. We now know the kind of facilities or the way we can transition our facilities to do it, but we need to invest in them to make it happen.
Well, a couple of thoughts here. So clearly ventilation and improvement of facilities, particularly places where people gather. And I know some folks have reached out to us specifically, we're at the Conference of Mayors, so my cities and village members have reached out and said, where we have our public meetings at City Hall, the ventilation isn't good. We need to do this, we need to do that to make it so that people can continue to socially distance in this wider space. That clearly would be something I would argue is eligible. To the extent you're using like a town highway garage, is that what you said, Matt?
Yeah.
That might be a little bit of a further reach, but if you think down the road, you're going to have to continue to use that because it's the only place in the town where you can get a number of people there to make sure they're socially distanced and safe. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that angle, but again, maybe you could make that argument. That one I would have to think about a little more, but it's an interesting concept. I mean, so you can't socially distance with the number of people that normally come to your meetings anywhere in town hall, city hall, village hall. So in order to use this, other space, can you improve that? You may be able to make that argument.
I was thinking about, there used to be these funds around called, I can't remember the name of the program. I want to say it was called Cool Down Funds or something like Cool Zone Funds. And that enabled
state funding, I think, Matt.
Yeah. That fire halls would equip a bingo hall with air conditioning, right? And then the theory was seniors or folks who were impoverished could come down to the bingo hall and cool off when it got over 100 degrees,
To some extent, could you use the excuse that with the FEMA funding that also came through because of the COVID-19 reactions and the reimbursements for that gives you the ability or some flexibility that you have some ARPA funds that you could utilize for resiliency and future preparedness, because that's what they're about also in their normal day-to-day operations. This is where they're supersizing the amount of money they put out there, but maybe they forgot that that's what they're also about in terms of resiliency and preparation and recovery. Parlay the two things together.
Yeah. Creative. And
you don't have to redeclare all your flood zones at this point. You just move past that. Get back to what FEMA itself is about with regard to, disaster.
Right.
Yeah.
My old friend Jack Marin asked a really creative question.
Of course he does.
About the fact I love my favorite part of COVID, if there's a favorite part of COVID, my favorite part of the pandemic response or the impact of the pandemic response was streaming of public meetings. It enabled me to get deep into my local government nerdness and attend city council meetings for places I'd never even heard of before. To the degree that we're going to need to be able to do this into the future, investing in that technology that enables us to stream public meetings. Barbara?
I'm chuckling because, and Jack, I'm glad you asked this question. I thought about it earlier and said, should I avoid it? Because I don't know the answer. But so I'm shocked that this is not mentioned anywhere, at least not that I have seen in any of the guidance documents and any of the, additional documents that other associations have put out there, because obviously this was a huge issue for everyone, how to deal with, the streaming of meetings and technology and, remote work and all of that. And I have not seen one mention of technology as an eligible use. So we just 2 days ago reached out to Treasury on this very question and NLC to say, obviously this is going to be a concern for a lot of people. And again, I think you can sort of argue to the extent you're trying to keep people safe. And if, things start to trend in the direction that they have already started to head in, and people need to do more remote meetings in that, I think you can make that argument that technology would help to mitigate the spread of COVID. But I just find it startling that that is not mentioned anywhere, at least not that we have found. So my hunch is that it's a yes, but I have not seen it explicitly stated anywhere. I think that could be one of the things we see that the Treasury adds to the FAQs, because I have to think that a lot of people are asking that same question that Jack did.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. We have run up against our time. There are a number of additional questions that were in the chat. We will circulate a link to the recording, a link to a number of different resources that Barbara and others have pointed out. And we encourage you to contact me. If you want to copy the PowerPoint, just drop me an email. I will circulate contact information for our two presenters today. And if anyone's interested in holding another roundtable, we're certainly open to the idea. I think it's been helpful. So thank you for participating, and we wish you the best of luck in your ARPA decision making. All right.
Thanks, MRB people. Appreciate it. Everybody be well and be safe.
Thank you, Jay.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Barbara.